also, began his own career or his own place as an author by doing books on uh, books, the look of books, and this has included his first "What We See When We Read," and another one called Cover, and most recently this, The Look of the Book, which everyone at our store keeps looking at because there's all these covers. But he has brought not only to what he's done with book design, but he's also brought to the way how we all see and look at books, a lot of creative thought and insight. Tonight, though, we're doing this on the occasion of his second novel. That is his writing more than his visual imagination. But in having him tonight for the delivery, which has just been published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and as you see it, there sometimes you don't, what form novels take these days. It does not have images, but it is a book that is striking to the eye. What is happening with the pace of language, with the space of language, and its density on the page, as well as certainly then what unfolds in the course of this book, which is the story of a young man who has come to this country and is trying to make his way to survive, and literally does this by delivering items and goods for a company that wants, has you on a real metered way to doing so. And it could be just that, what this book is, but it actually does so much more as a meditation on what we buy, what comes to us, how it comes to us, what it means to have all this happen, and the role of this a person who's described as a boy, a delivery boy, and even the whole manifestation of what it is to become an adult and grow into a more larger or more place in the scheme of things. So there are many things that go on in this book, and this will get explored tonight in form of Peter's reading, and also a conversation with Andrew Ridker. Andrew, as I mentioned, has worked in book publishing. He's actually now, as of a year and a half ago, the author of the book very fine novel called The Altruists. And he and Peter go back, and as I say, both as working colleagues, but as ongoing conversationalists. So I think tonight we'll be engaging that way. In fact, when we got on at the beginning, they said, they've not been keeping in touch. So they've actually, this will be a good way for that all to happen, which may mean other subjects come up. We'll see. They both are
TBD.
Wonderful and engaging that way. My colleague Karen is already posting information on their books in the chat. And you also are invited to put questions as we go along in the chat. The evening after, probably early on, Peter will read, and then he and Andrew will have a conversation. And then at some point, Andrew will work your questions in to their conversation. And at some point, I will then come back and bid everyone a good night. But before then, we're all sure to have a very good time. I didn't mention, I think Karen's put in the chat that this is Peter's second novel, and 2 years ago saw the publication of Same, which is a paperback original and also a brilliant and wonderful book. So we're thankful they're here. We're thankful all of you are here on the various places you are. And we now ask you to please give your good attention and to both Peter Mendelsund and Andrew Ridker. Take it away, gentlemen. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Karen. It's nice to be here. Andrew, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to say to start, but I'm happy to read if you think that's a good way to kick it off.
I have nothing to say to you. No, yeah, start it off. Why don't you give us a reading, and then I'll jump in. Okay.
But maybe what I'll just say in terms of prefatory remarks is, because there may not be time for this later, which is that Andrew and I did in fact meet at Knopf when Andrew was an assistant editor there and I was an art director, and our desks were maybe 10, 12 feet away from one another, and we became extremely fast friends. And in fact, our first works of fiction were developed in parallel with one another, very much in the time in which we should have been doing our day jobs. We would be in each other's office spaces asking questions about character development and how dialogue works and plotting. So this feels extremely satisfying for me anyway, to be having this conversation in this, I guess you would call it a public sphere, even though I can't see anybody but Andrew right now, which is fine.
Yeah,
Fine.
sorry.
I know you're out there.
No one should have to do that.
So, and just lastly, that The Altruists is a really wonderful novel, and I urge you all to go out and get it. It's in paperback now, and it is smart and caustic and funny and all the good things. So that's by way of plugging Andrew. But I am now going to read a little bit from the delivery. This is just a short passage. As Rick said, it tells the story of this young man who is in this kind of indentured servitude in a nameless place where he bikes around and delivers goods to people who are better off than he is. And although some of this may chime with you in terms of present events and the various demographics who do exactly these things, it's also very much a parable. But to set the stage for the reading, we're just at a point halfway through the novel where our titular character, the delivery boy, has gotten himself in some trouble. And to make up for that, he has to deliver these sort of nefarious packages outside of his normal delivery zone. And he has initially very excited feelings about being given this particular task and granted this kind of agency. But soon it becomes a little bit more sinister, and I won't tell you what happens at the end, but I will read you this passage now. He wove among the cars, finding lanes that should not have existed, that were folded and unfolded by the flow of traffic. He knew every move of each vehicle on the street, and anticipating, made the most of it, cutting up the roadway in unexpected shapes, his bike a blade, and he found himself laughing at drivers and taunting other delivery boys. He leaned far to one side and then corrected to the other, never having to stop at lights, at crosswalks, never having to dismounting at intersections. He thought of this as a failure and a kind of child's game. And soon the way opened up, and looking ahead as he coasted, he began to feel the neighborhood around him transform. But into what? All the streets and roundabouts he had become intimate with over those days and months, for who knows how long. Those streets that he had once believed would always be a part of a disorienting and alien future. This old route was perhaps now becoming precisely that, old, scenery, part of the long unfurling of his past. Now he was moving towards something, and that something was getting it right. This, he concluded, was being a man about things, which meant insisting and then accepting, no, embracing the penalties for such insistence, declaring one's feelings and being rebuked if necessary. This was it. Yes, there were new debts to be paid, and yes, the new path was not without peril. But the delivery boy now noticed a fresh excitement surge out of some subterranean spring, an excitement at traveling outside the tightly belted limits of his old circumscribed life. He was full up, ready, as if the world were suddenly and unaccountably available, affordable, proffered. In that moment, he felt nothing but this strange upwelling sense of agency. He released his grip, tucked his legs up, closed his eyelids slightly against the wind, and felt it play on his teeth and on the back of his throat. He opened and closed his mouth, and as he did so, the wind produced the snap of a bitten red, yellow, green fruit. The delivery boy saw the borderlands of his old neighborhood as a new series of discrete pictures, as if he were already transcribing the saga of his own great journey. A tall striped stack made of stamped tin jutting out from the middle of the avenue, gouting smoke. He and the rest of the traffic divided around it and slackened, as if the street and all of its noise, motion, and commerce, and even the delivery boy himself, were powered by currents of underground steam, which now leaking lost vital energy and slowed the entire apparatus. An old man, angled forward, bent almost in half as he walked, his hands clasped behind his back. A young man leaning against a lamppost, smoking. He had a dog on a leash, A young woman approached, bent down, and spoke to the dog. The young man took a last drag of his cigarette and flicked it away. The late afternoon sun perched directly on a chimney like an egg in an egg cup. A man flipping and dropping a coin while another man watched. A doorman spraying down the already wet sidewalk with a hose. 3 women gathered over a phone, smiling as if they were bending over a cradle. A man driving past him in a car that was shiny and yellow. And though the delivery boy thought the yellow was wicked, he wondered what it must be like to drive that car on days when the driver felt sad. A visibly crazy woman gibbering into a roadside help box. A man carrying a mirror across the street, which is to say, an unexpected, if brief and blurred, portrait of a ragged, determined delivery boy. The wind against him, he chugged up a hill, and when he came over to the other side, he saw the neighborhood's main commercial street and the demarcation of its northern boundary. Coffee chain, tobacconist, appliances, purveyors of ladies' underwear, sporting goods, bath bombs and soaps, candy, computers, phones, and other electronic appliances. A hotel, another coffee chain, fast food, t-shirts, another fast food, shoes, more clothing, a retail park, pub, mattresses, family restaurant, all fronted by glass display windows. People streaming in and out of oversized chrome doors, thumping music leaking out with the air conditioning, cars double parked, always a hazard for delivery boys, and generally lawless sidewalks swarming with tourists and shopping bags, people bustling, arguing, sulking, a child wailing. The atmosphere here carried, like the atmospheres in municipal offices or in waiting rooms, a mood of depleted power, a sense of vital force having been sapped despite the outward prosperity. The delivery boy felt the energy leach from his legs, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might have to get off his bike and rest. And he remembered how, in the department store, he had sat down on one of the plush banquettes, and for only a moment, mirrors all around him, color everywhere, sounds bearing down, and the trouble he had then rising again, after having given in to the siren song of lethargy, which had overwhelmed him, a strong and suffocating lassitude. But not now. There would be no resting, not with so much in the balance. So he shook his head and slapped one of his cheeks, attempting to revive. He pedaled. Several blocks later, at the next rise, he saw in a space between 2 large buildings a view from which he could see out farther. His head cleared instantly. The clouds ahead were massed into tall, pale towers against the yellowing sky. These clouds were north of the city, maybe over Manor Grove. Imagining the blurred outlines of Manor Grove, his destination, out across the broad river, he then felt another new kind of longing. He turned off the power assist just so that he could feel his own muscles working. He needed the toil, and he craved the horizon, and so he pedaled towards it. Skimming, he says you are stealing from him, N had reported. Good, thought the delivery boy. Good, that fucker. He biked faster, working himself hard, not noticing that he had just passed the boundaries of the old neighborhood and had entered a new one entirely. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I just have to say, I'm super thrilled to be here and to be talking to you about this terrific book, which I believe is your 5th, which is crazy. But as you said, Peter, Peter and I met working at Knopf, and it just occurred to me actually that just behind my computer here, I have this very adorable photo from some party sometime or another. But take that as proof that this is a real friendship, no fake friends. But I'm just so glad to be here and be talking to you about this book.
Yeah, ditto. I was thinking, and I think I said this right before we got on, that these events are just really wonderful excuses to see people you haven't seen in a while. So
yeah,
I'm glad that everybody else gets to ride along.
Yeah, and it did occur to me too that we're not really the best at letting each other finish sentences ever. So I'm going to do my best tonight. But I did want to ask to start out, just, I was pretty much literally in the room when you wrote your first novel, same, and vice versa. For me, we kind of learned to write novels together in one sense. And so I watched you go through that process and you watched me, but now I'm curious to know what was writing a second novel like? Did you feel like a beginner again, or did you feel a certain confidence having done it before? I'm just curious to know how that second book process went for you.
I mean, I think that's a great question and super fertile ground, I think, for both of us to talk about, because I think, I mean, there's certain kinds of artists in any medium who, there's sort of the person who sort of finds a form and then drills down into it. And I think there are those that sort of feel like they need to reinvent the wheel every time out. And I think I'm sort of cursed to be the second type, which sucks, not just for me, but for everybody. But so in a way, I felt like, to answer the question, it was very, very similar feelings of anxiety and dislocation and discombobulation with this one, because the form was just so different. And, I'm working on my third one now. And again, it's just a completely different kind of voice and form. And, I think there's certain kind of methodological things that I found have been helpful just in terms of like building good habits in terms of writing, but that has less to do with sort of sentence construction and form. And, I would be curious to hear your answer to that. I don't know what this novel is like that you're writing right now, but is it a similar form to Altruists?
Sort of similar enough, but it's the same thing. It's this feeling of, it's like starting over all over again. But I think you're right that the method is, at least this time, not to freak out when you hit a wall, that you can get past it. But
I will just add that, just an interesting sort of biographical note about this book was that it was written so quickly that there really wasn't, I mean, Same was written over a longer period of time, is a much longer and maximalist kind of novel. Hence, there's just more neurosis per square inch in that book, because it's just, the more time you spend with something, the more time you have to agonize over it, the less you like it, the less you like yourself, rinse and repeat. Not Weepers, that's the third one. What is this novel called? The Delivery. The Delivery was written in really, honest to God, a 4-month period. And, it's not a huge word count, so that makes that kind of thing a lot easier. But because of the form of the book being as, at least in the beginning, and we'll probably talk about this eventually, as sort of like minimal and lapidary as it is, I was able to sketch out the novel very quickly. And then it was just a question of sort of filling it in. And I don't know, Andrew, if I mentioned this to you at any point, but I sort of had this thought, which is that it's not maybe the worst way to write a novel to just write the whole thing one sentence per chapter first. I mean, I guess you'd call that an outline, but it's slightly different. That's kind of how The Delivery was written. It was just a series of sentences, and then some of them just accordioned out, and some of them just remained as single sentences.
Well, it's definitely an interesting question in terms of like how form is a result of process, and how if you change your process, the form's going to be different. And so, yeah, in a lot of senses, it just makes a lot of sense what you're saying. Writing in that way, producing a book, which for those at home who haven't read yet, yeah, the first half, 2/3 of the book is very fragmentary, and the fragments start to expand, and the chapters grow longer, and the sentences grow longer. And I do want to get to that in a little bit, because I think I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the narrator. But I'm also curious, it occurred to me that in a lot of our conversations a couple years ago when we were working together, we would get into these debates where we would wind up taking like far more extreme stances on things on like sort of loose opinions, and dig each other into opposite corners. And in those conversations, I wound up playing the conservative, traditional, realist, Buddenbrooks kind of is, Tolstoy is the model for the novel. And you would get pushed off into your direction of avant-garde experimental writing, Robbe-Grillet, Pynchon, et cetera. And we would sort of push each other into these corners as we talked. And it made me think about a sort of truism that gets tossed around in the writing workshop universe, which typically in a more sort of also realist writing space, which is, the universal is in the specific, right? That idea of like, the more you drill down into a super specific detail, the more paradoxically relatable it becomes. But of course, in this book, you have not named your characters, you've not told us where they're from or where they are in the present. There's a lot of identifying details that are very deliberately sort of refused. And so I was curious about that choice. And so really, which is to say, is the universal in the specific? Is the universal in the universal? Do you care about the universal? I mean, I'm just curious about these choices.
I mean, there's so much to unpack in that question. I mean, yes, that's true. I think actually our commitments, you and me, Andrew, are far less extreme. You're right about that, than we would end up in those arguments. I really honestly find a lot of experimental literature unreadable. And, like I haven't finished yet, but I've almost finished reading all of Proust. So obviously like, I'm a traditionalist on some level. So there's that. I don't know, in some ways, in the time since we were spending every hour in each other's company, it's not just that my thinking on these things has loosened, but I actually don't really think about them anymore so much, and definitely not when I'm writing. Like, I don't think about these positions as positions. I sort of think about, well, what is it that I want to try to get across here, and what's the best way to do it? And in a way, I think being a visual artist at the same time as somebody that's writing novels has informed the way the form of the novels ends up more than some affiliation with some form of modernism or postmodernism or experimentalism. I see words on the page as carrying semantic value, but also as pictures on some level, and it's hard for me to ditch that. And I think this, of all the books that I've written, is probably the one that takes the most advantage of that idea of the space on the page. So that's part of it. But at heart, it's actually a very unexperimental book, in the sense that it does tell, I mean, it's a parable, so the oldest of forms, really. But then layered into it is increasingly so a kind of, I want to say, like Nabokovian kind of nostalgic and adjective heavy kind of prose that, also springs from a kind of literature that I absolutely love. It's interesting to see, I don't want to say the word shoehorn, but it's just interesting to see how forms can even just coexist in the same work. So, I mean, I think even just the diktat that like a work of literature has to be one form or another is wrong and misleading. But interestingly, this third piece of fiction that I'm working on now is just like straight ahead realism. It's very voicey. It's kind of a black comedy. Like, it's absolutely different in every possible way from the things that I've written before. So, I don't know. Maybe it's just like, do you ever feel this, Andrew, this just wanting to put up barricades against boredom in your work, and then just like trying to throw something in there that's just going to stir the pot in some way and change up your method, your voice, your form?
Yeah, I think formally, certainly, like formal constraints can be a great way to just set up, like a whole other set of boundaries. But to that, yeah, I'm wondering, did you say at the outset this is going to be a parable, or did it kind of turn into a I mean, did you set a parameter of like, this is not going to be deeply grounded in like hyper realistic, up to the moment detail? I want to push that away. I want to write symbols as symbols instead of, the more traditional model of, say, you write the detail, and if it becomes a symbol, it becomes a symbol, by some sort of a Cyrillic meaning. But this book feels very like deliberately,
I mean,
withholding, but not in a no moral judgment on that. You're just like, it's withholding certain things very deliberately, it seems.
yes. I mean, a couple of things. One is, yes. I mean, I think after Same, which was so like blah, like here it all is. Here's everything. Like I wanted to write something that was a little more, I mean, withholding sounds pejorative, but yeah, I mean, I wanted to write something in which the gaps and the
Spare.
refs and the pauses said as much as the other stuff. So, and it's funny, actually, I'd been reading, oh God, I have to remind myself to not get too theoretical. I was going to say something about Roland Barthes, and I'm going to be very brief on Roland Barthes. Okay, no, it's going to be so short, I promise you. Which was that in the last thing he ever wrote, which he didn't write, was a lecture that he gave at the university in Paris on the novel, which has now been translated and published by Columbia University Press. It's called The Preparation for the Novel, is Barthes sort of writing about what he values in a novel and how he would go about writing one. And one of the things I found very interesting about that is he talks a lot about haiku. And the question that Barthes asks himself is, how can you get the immediacy of a haiku, but prolong it in a way that it can last and have this sort of both temporal length and depth of a novel? And it's a question that he didn't really resolve, but I think that was sort of in my brain when I started, was this idea of haiku and like this idea of the immediacy of single assertions, like aphoristic assertions, or descriptions, or statements of intent that could be just sort of taken as its own thing, like a monad, and then just sort of thought about, and the immediacy of the world when it comes to you that way. That words, I think, when they're not surrounded by a lot of words, I found, when they're just sort of on their own, as it were, accrue a certain kind of power to them. And old words that are prosaic and normal, all of a sudden are imbued with this kind of like, they become luminous in some way, and then they draw attention to themselves. And that's interesting. And I found that as the book progresses and the book gets more wordy, interestingly, you find out more. There's more detail, there's more nuance, there's more color. And yet there is also a kind of exhaustion that happens through that process that's also, I think, super interesting. So it's a little bit of an experiment. I mean, it doesn't surprise me now that I'm working on something that's just like as normie as you could possibly get.
Well, yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think, yeah, for people at home who haven't read yet or who are reading now, like there's this really wonderful evolution that happens from these staccato poetic bursts into these longer sections that feels completely natural and feels very like just it smoothly transitions. And I wondered if that was ever part of the plan, if that happened organically. I should say too, maybe for context, that you sort of start the novel under the assumption that this is a third person narrator, and then slowly these first person asides start coming in, and those first person asides get longer and longer, and it's almost like the curtain is being slowly pulled back on a narrative voice that's actually been the intelligence hovering over the book the whole time. And did that voice happen as naturally as it does as a reading experience? Did you just slowly start peeling it back, or were you like, there will be a narrator who will slowly reveal himself and I just have to like be patient with it?
It's hard for me to remember, honestly, but when I do think back on the period in which I was writing the very, very beginning, it occurred to me early on. I mean, this is something I should probably just admit out loud, but you're writing about somebody probably of color, probably BIPOC. Like this is a parable, right? So we don't know where we are, we don't know who these people are, but in the place that we live, in the time that we live, we know that I'm writing a story that is about somebody whose story I have no right to tell. And I think basically what happened is very early on in the sort of recounting of this boy's difficult life, I realized that there was a voice in my head that started to ask the question, well, to what extent am I in my rights to tell this story? How much of it? How much do I have to have disclaimers? I felt some guilt around it as I was writing it that I think should have been felt. It was right to feel it. And it felt very organic then to have the book be polyphonic in that way, and to have the voice of the person who's wondering what it means to care for wonder about, and then narrate in your imagination the story of someone else. And that really is the story of the book. The book is dedicated to my grandparents who were survivors. And, I got some of those stories, but some of those stories from them I didn't get. There was a lot of silence around those things, as is normal, as I'm sure you know. And so I did a lot of filling in of those blanks myself as a kid. But also, the empathetic muscle, I think, is an important one to develop. And this idea of, okay, so you don't co-opt or you don't colonize someone else's story. Does that mean that you can't feel it or wonder about it or have it awaken in you some secret compassion? Can it enlarge your heart in some way to endeavor, at least, knowing that you're going to fail, to think about the hardships of others? So that's really where the narrator comes from. In the beginning, it was just, he was the voice in my head that was like, hey, hold up, what are you doing? Like, to what extent? I mean, but it also raises an interesting question, which, as has been reported throughout the centuries, writers are vampires. Like,
What, and I don't want to spoil too much for people, but just to say that the narrator of this novel is not just it's not just you, it's not just an escape hatch, it's not just a hovering. The narrator comes to be a character whose life, as we glimpse it, has quite a lot in common with the character he's writing about, or at least some echoes and some interesting echoes. And I won't say too more for fear of spoiling some things, but as readers get to the end of the book, I think you start to see like this voice, which begins, like you say, as this kind of questioning, like, well, how can I really know what goes on in the delivery boy's mind? You start to actually feel by the end that he certainly can. His own experiences have informed his ability to get inside that character's mind, and I think there's some real, there was some really beautiful tension and reverberations between the narrator's story and the story he's, if not writing, then at least commenting on.
Yes, I'm glad that came across, because that really became the project, was to find the ways in which the narrator's life and past chimes with the delivery boy, the story that he's telling. But moreover, the way I thought of it was that him endeavoring to tell this story allows him, in fact, a way to perform this archaeology of his own life and difficulties. And I think in a way that is the linchpin of how compassion works, is this idea of finding the similarities between our joys and traumas and other people's joys and traumas, and knowing that they can never map one to one, but still recognizing that as members of similar species, built the same way with the same kinds of DNA, and structures of hope and desire and loss, that it's important to acknowledge those parallels, even if they're never exactly the same or certainly not equal. In this case, the idea was for them to chime.
I remember, when we spoke last, I guess 2 years ago now, about the last book. You talking about your I'll forever will keep coming back to this, but your puppeteer friend who.
Finn, whose mother is actually on this chat, I think.
Oh, amazing. Yes. So, and I guess he told you that as a puppeteer, you have to perform the story that the puppets are performing, and also acknowledge the artifice of the fact that it's a guy holding strings, because the audience can see it and it seems silly not to acknowledge it. And this is where, this feels like a very particular concern of yours across all of your work, of even in your book jackets of I mean, how many jackets have you done that in various, inventive ways point to the fact that it's a book jacket, that knows it's a book jacket, and I think exactly what you're saying, that this book, The Delivery, is about empathy, is about the limits and liberation of a writer's imagination, and how far can a writer go and where shouldn't a writer go.
Yes,
And
that's exactly right. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
interrupting you as you said I
No.
shouldn't. But as you and I know, and as other people who don't work in publishing may not know, that delivery is a publishing term too. It's the moment at which a novel is sent in its final form. So yes, That's exactly right.
I want to make a quick note here and say that if anyone has questions, they can put them in the chat. I see we have one already, and we will get to those. So
yeah, don't be shy, guys. Just feel
Yeah.
free to ask anything. There are no dumb questions, and I'm happy, and Andrew's happy to answer any of them. So jump on board, and we'll get to them for sure.
Yeah, please. But I want to say, so maybe just to ground us a little bit more. So this is a novel about work. It's basically set completely on the job, so to speak. We follow the delivery boy through a day or so, and we are literally over his shoulder as he makes deliveries, gets tips, gets starred reviews or doesn't, reports back to his dispatcher, goes back to the warehouse. Like, we are at work with this main character. And I don't know, it occurred to me that for all Americans work, which is like more than ever before and more than most Europeans, and we don't have a lot of novels set at work. We spend all our time at work, but we don't write about or read about work nearly to a proportional degree. And I know you've had a lot of jobs and careers, many in the arts, but not all, plenty of other kinds of jobs too that might map a little bit more closely to your characters than your work in design or writing or music or visual art. But I guess I wondered what attracted you to writing about work, and also your relationship to writing and work. Like, is design your day job? Is writing your passion? Is it flipped? Do you have a million? I mean, how does work factor into your artistic process?
That's such a good question, and it's such a great observation. You're right. There's not a surfeit of fiction written about people at their jobs, which is, of course, you're absolutely right, where we spend a burgeoning amount of our time. It's and I think that's because, well, I mean, we read for so many reasons, but certainly for escapism and,
Sure.
Who wants to be back in the cubicle? But, what's interesting is, like, I thought, oh boy, so many good questions in that question. The first thing to say is that, yes, you were at work with him. I thought of this novel as a kind of novel of escape, without saying what happens at the end, because it's ambiguous anyway. I thought of this novel as being a novel in which somebody's work changes in a way radically, such that somebody's life changes radically. And so it was important to just lay the groundwork. And in fact, the beginning of the novel, which is the most minimal part of it, it's just essentially like reading the rules of a board game, right? It's sort of like, this is how the pieces move. And I wanted it to be simple that way. I just wanted to acclimatize the reader immediately to the calculus that this boy's life was, like, it's a very small area. These are the places he delivers to. These are the things he delivers. Here are the rules that he understands. Here are the ones that he doesn't understand. Here are the hazards. Here are the joys. I just sort of wanted to establish that just right off of the bat. So in a way, I wasn't even really thinking about it as work as much as I was thinking about it as sort of the rules of the novel. Like, here's, it's sort of like the map at the beginning of a fantasy novel. Like, well, so here's where the thing takes place, and, here are the things you need to know.
And was it, I mean, this might be, I don't remember who said it, and you mentioned Nabokov earlier, it could have been him, but that, not, or great novels teach you how to read them or something to that effect. And I think that, that as you read the first couple chapters of this book, it's telling you how to read it at the same time. It's sort of like the rules are that we're going to have short chapters and we're going to follow him on these deliveries, and I'm going to punctuate it this way. But then gradually the rules change or evolve. But we're still at work with him. I mean, it's just so,
you're right.
It has to be the book that surely no novel before this has taken place on a bicycle to this extent, right? Like, the book takes place on a bicycle in a lot. I mean, it's just
here's a little secret. that I'll tell nobody but you and the people who I can't see right now, which is that in a way, a model for this was Cheever's The Swimmer, in the sense that it was, again, a very circumscribed area. It was somebody whose life was weighing down on him, who was at a moment of existential dread, who then went on a kind of journey that's told in a kind of mythically large way, like, you know, like Jack London, that kind of sort of like wilderness survival story, but told in basically an urban, or in the case of Cheever, suburban setting. So in a way, I was thinking more just about this notion of somebody trying to travel in an unconventional way through an area that normally doesn't kind of admit of that kind of travel, especially as a means of escape. So like Cheever, you know, for those of you who've not read this short story, it's this man who's doing this epic swim essentially through various swimming pools in what is essentially Westchester County. So it was a similar kind of thing. I thought of it kind of more as a travel log in some ways than I thought of it as work. But, you know, it was also hard for me to not acknowledge that this is a story about a particular kind of work that exists under all of our noses, that enables us to function in various ways, that is done by real human beings who have hopes and desires. And I wouldn't say that I was trying to tell their story, because I couldn't. But it was also important for me to think through what that kind of life must be like. So there is actually, there's an anecdote in the story in which the delivery boy goes to a kind of fancy house to deliver something, and the person can't find their wallet, and he's waiting for them, and he's invited in the house, and he sees a bunch of trinkets on the wall, and one of them is a picture or a statue, a little statuette of the dictator from his homeland, from whom he had to flee, and who killed his family, et cetera, et cetera. Now that's actually something that happened to me, because like the asshole that I am, the designer that I am, I happen to have like some Mao propaganda in my house that looks extremely beautiful, and I thought was amazingly cool because of the printing process and blah, blah, blah. And I did have this moment with, that was a little like the moment in Marathon Man, where the woman sees Laurence Olivier on the street in the Diamond District, and it's like, you were the one in the camps.
Yeah.
So, you know, some of this is about an investigation of a very particular kind of work done by a very specific subaltern class, without, again, being specific in the sense of race or nationality or time or place.
Yeah, well, that's just amazing to hear about the Cheever. I had not thought of that, but it completely clicks. And so I'd certainly suggest everyone after reading the delivery, yeah, I mean, now I want to go read The Swimmer, because I can see it, and that just unlocks something for me. And yeah, I'll say too, that scene about with the sort of tchotchke, like of the dictator, or the strongman, I think he's called, is absolutely one of my favorite scenes, and totally illustrates like that moment of, even though it's a parable, even though we're not going to be specific about what country the character is from, that was like a universal in the universal moment for me. That was like this could be Mao, this could be Stalin, this could be, but whoever it is, you know, this semi-ironic tchotchke is like,
right,
or just piece of memorabilia or whatever is extremely fraught with meaning.
And also another way in which writing fiction is a Trojan horse for my deep shames of various kinds.
Well, you know, join the club there. I mean, we're all
right,
wallowing in it together. I
do we want to engage with some of these questions?
Yeah, let's do it. So first question from Jared, who says, "Hi, Peter, I'm a long admirer, or a great admirer of your writing and design work. What medium, longhand, computer, typewriter, etc., do you prefer to write and edit in? I'm curious because as a musician, I find that writing music at different instruments leads to different musical styles and modes."
Sure.
So yeah, how do you
that
write?
Is such a great question, Jared. That's amazing. And actually, I've had that experience because in a past life, I was a musician, and so I also composed. Back then, we used finale in Sibelius. I don't, and I've had that experience of writing, say, like a string quartet and writing it on the piano, and the ways in which that changes, obviously, the manner in which you hear instrumental color actually inhibits it. So that's a really great question. And I also remember, actually, Andrew, when we were working on our novels, I was experimenting with Scrivener,
yeah,
which is a kind of word processor that allows you to move small chunks around very easily, whereas Microsoft Word is this extremely linear kind of thing in which you just start and you keep going. I thought the Scrivener was going to be the answer to all of my prayers, and it would enable me to write in this kind of atomistic way. But in the end, nowadays what I do is I write in notebooks. I write a lot of stuff longhand, very loosely, and then I transcribe it into Word. And I find there's something, I'm doing this more and more as I write. This was not the way Same Same was written. The delivery was written pretty much exclusively in Word. But this new novel, I'm finding it very freeing to write in longhand, and then transcribe it. And I think just mainly because changing up the medium, no matter what the medium is, sometimes just frees your thinking up. I'm not saying that longhand is better, but actually I just find in all media, in design, in music, whatever it is, just being able to change some little thing about your procedure often can give you some new upwelling of energy and some perspective that you otherwise wouldn't have. Do you ever find that, Andrew?
well, I'm like a boring Microsoft Word top to bottom kind of guy, but I remember learning once that and this could be totally apocryphal, but that like Don DeLillo writes one sentence per page in his word processor, and I think maybe blows it up really big. But the idea being,
I've heard of
to pay
people that
very
do
close
that. That is
attention
crazy.
to each word and sentence. But it makes total sense, because then you read his work, and the process has a very particular result, which is that these sentences accumulate. Each one could stand on its own, but then they accumulate, and it affects pacing, and it affects all these things. So
yes. And by the way, I'm seeing that Chloe Sheffy here, the wonderful designer and art director and illustrator, just remembered that when we worked together as designers, that I was laying out same pages on the floor. And actually that is a really interesting thing that I don't know if it's really interesting. To me, it's interesting that I do this. I don't know if you do this, Andrew, but there is something to laying out the book on a floor, on a wall, and sort of looking at it from afar, that it gives you some sense of perspective. The difficult thing about novels for me, like the most difficult thing, is being able to contain it in your head at any given time, the deeper into it you get, such that you're actually productively writing rather than just kind of,
I do remember, though, too, and this is kind of embarrassing for me, but I remember at some point I sent you some pages from what I was working on, and I had you format it in some
Oh,
sort of
that's right.
fancy
I remember that.
typescript on nice paper. And I took a picture of it and sent it to my now wife and was like, look, like my stupid Word doc looks like a book. And it really changed the way I saw it. But then I remember feeling like I can't get too used to this feeling, because I'm not scrutinizing the
Right.
text the way I would if it was an ugly Times New Roman, because it looks finished,
Right. And there's an anxiety that's incumbent with seeing something typeset too, that,
it's like irreversible at that point.
Right. Do you want me to read some of these questions?
Yeah, Kristen wants to know about your transition from designer to author. Were you always writing? Was it a natural progression? Did you expect to write earlier in your career? How did you move? And you've also made a bunch of other interesting moves too, between music and painting and other things. So yeah, what's that process been like?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'd like to say that I always knew that I wanted to make things. And I think as I got older, became more sort of agnostic about what those things would be. When I was a kid, I wanted to be Horowitz. Like, I wanted to be a pianist, and that's what I spent my first 30 years doing. And I just assumed that that was the way that I was going to put art into the world. And the older I get and the more I make stuff, the more I just feel like there's no need to constrain yourself to a label, actually, other than the fact that I found that the public really wants you to have one. And that we live in a strange time, actually, where I think like the sort of the bad hint of amateurism hovers over people that maybe have more than one commitment, like it's polyamory or something, or like there is a kind of, I think, strange attitude towards that. But the truth is, I've always really liked writing. I love it. It's extremely fun, and its satisfactions are so totally different from painting or music or really unique. But just the idea of world building in any medium is just so freaking compelling. I just can't manage to kick that need and that high, and I know, Andrew, you feel this too, but when you're writing something and it's going well, and you feel like you've built something that's uniquely yours, that's not that it really does feel like world building, even if you're just writing about the here and now. It's a feeling of control that's kind of unmatched, I feel like, in other media, maybe other than music. I know we're getting short on time, so I want to get to Ben's question.
Yeah.
Should I read that? The traffic
Yeah,
control
go for it.
descriptions of the city begin to remind me of a sort of grammar punctuation. Can you comment or expand on that? Ben, you're a very, very good reader. Yes, in fact, the traffic, the streets, the rhythms of the streets are absolutely meant to mirror syntax and grammar, and there are lots of little nods to that in the book. They're like, I can remember moments where, the street is patched and they're described as parentheses. There's all kinds of sort of syntactic and grammatical nods in the book. So that's absolutely what was intended. In fact, there's lots of little sort of meta-linguistic stuff that happens in the book in which feelings are described as subjunctive, and there's a lot of attention paid to reminding the reader, the careful reader, which you clearly are, that that the book is about language. So yes.
And I'm just curious, and this is kind of just to quickly go off another of the questions in the chat, but so the relationship between design and the form of the book, when you personally are writing the book or transferring it from longhand to word processor, but when you're at the computer typing stage, whatever that is, are you laying out the book the way a designer might, or do you pass the manuscript off to your publisher and they lay it out and it doesn't look, or are you controlling the spacing and the margins and things like you might in a design project?
No, actually, this one just came to them as a Word file. The only like really conscientious choice were the paragraph spaces and the paragraph breaks, which are these thin rules. And other than sort of one moment where the boy is looking up at some stars and he constellates them in a particular way so they form a particular letter for a particular reason. That's really the only piece of overt design in the book, other than the book itself, which is shaped like a crescendo, which is, a musical piece of musical notation, which is a picture. It has meaning. And it's also a very specific direction in terms of what you're supposed to do with volume. So the book is shaped that way. It starts small and it gets bigger.
And for those who have read the book too, you have a very beautiful, and now I realize also very self-aware as ever, description of what a crescendo actually of what a crescendo actually means, and you show us the symbol for the crescendo, and you have a character explain the crescendo, which is, I should not have been surprised. Yeah, makes perfect sense. Is also
and in fact, this book is, like, I would say, of anything I've ever written, it's the one that contains the most media in that sense. That my involvement with prose, obviously, but also with images and with music are more present in this particular book than anything else I've ever written.
Well, I remember too when you were writing same that we were talking. There was and I don't want to pull back the curtain too much, but that um, there was a time where, or a draft where maybe there would be some more visual components, some illustrations, so to speak.
Mhm.
And we talked about that a lot, and I
Yeah,
think it went back and forth a lot because it
yeah,
was like, I want to, does this enhance the text or take something away? And I
mm,
think also, not to play armchair analyst, but it was a feeling too of like, I don't want to be the designer writer.
yeah, that's
I
right.
don't want to lean on design necessarily, but here you're bringing in some of
When have
those.
you not been the armchair therapist, analyst? But you're absolutely right. Like, it was a very conscientious choice to disassociate. I mean, the truth is, I don't design anymore. I just, it's been years since I've designed things. I'm really not a designer. I find it incredibly interesting that, especially in reviews or when the books are written about whether they're fiction or nonfiction, that I'm always referred to as designer Peter Mendelsund. It's like there's got to be a tipping point where that changes, but maybe not. Maybe there's a moment where I'll be musician Peter Mendelsund again. You never know.
It's
One
like,
lives in
I
hope.
think it's like living in New York. Like you have to put in your 15 years or whatever, no,
Can I
or
respond very quickly to Jared's question
yeah,
about
please.
writing schedule and how do you balance all of those things? Jared, you're asking really great questions. I wish I knew you because these are very pertinent to me. The answer is very badly. Like, the story of my life is the story of really needing to have a job and make money, and that job is not writing fiction. And I do have a family, and I have two lovely children, and I do freelance work, and I have this day job at the Atlantic, and my life is crazy. And the answer to your question is, like, I just try to find any minute I can where, you know, like, a lot of this book was written on the subway, just like I'd write something on my phone, I'd send an email to myself. It's stolen moments. It's really the best I could do. It's not ideal, but I think maybe the moral is, I get very wound up about not having enough space and time to be a writer. Um, and it is true that I really wish that there were more time in the day, or that I didn't have this day job. But I love my day job, especially if anybody from the Atlantic is here. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the need to make money and support yourself is a big one, and it is very hard to do that writing, especially, I would say, experimental literature, but literature in general. And so it is what it is. But the day's longer than you think it is, and you do find these strange moments of idleness where you really can just throw something down. It's more habit than anything. If you can get into good habits, I mean, Andrew, you're a very, very diligent writer. So I don't know, would you agree? Like, habit is kind of everything, like just building discipline.
Yeah, I think also I liken it sometimes to like just working out, in the sense that when you haven't exercised in a while, it's hell to get off the couch and do it. Like there's all that accumulated lethargy, but
Hmm.
when you're jogging 3 or 4 days a week, it suddenly becomes harder not to do it. Your body kind of wants, it's like, hey, it's Tuesday, we're supposed to go on that jog. Like this is what we do now. So I
Hmm.
think, yeah, getting to the point, I think it's different approaches, like stolen moments and on the other hand, if you can get some sort of regular practice going, I think you just start to want to do it more than you don't want to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
Um,
and also just tricking yourself into automatisms. Like, it's sort of like practicing an instrument. When you're a kid, it's frustrating, it's hard, nothing really works. The more you do it, the more it just becomes part of the warp and woof of your life, and you just, in a way, it's just like, I guess you were alluding to this a second ago. It's just a thing you do, like breathing.
Right. And I wanted to, before we wrap up, echo Karen from Elliott Bay in the chat and just say, this is, um, regardless of your preferred format, print, e-reader, whatever, this is a book that, for the beauty of its jacket or lack of jacket, its cover, its layout, but also the importance that the layout has to the story. This is a book that, if you can, we'd highly suggest you picking up a print copy, obviously from Elliott Bay Books. But this is definitely one where the layout matters, the pacing really matters. It's been put together very deliberately and intentionally and with a great deal of care. And so if you can get a copy in hardcover and print and read it, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you feel, Peter, too, about
Yes, from your
that,
local
but
independent,
this
please.
feels like a special case, you know?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if it's a special case. I haven't even looked at the ebook yet, so I don't even know how they sort of manage those kind of issues of pacing. But I'm a big believer in the artifact. The physical edition of a book. It is a particularly unique and satisfying experience is to be within those covers as opposed to being on a device which mediates all kind of other behavior. A book really asks that you pay a specific kind of attention to it. So yeah, I would definitely co-sign to that one, Andrew. Yeah, and I think we're getting close to time. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah. Yes, you do.
One more.
And if we don't have another question, then I'm happy to wrap up.
I could, yeah, or I had a really quick question, Peter, for you, which is just, I mean, this is kind of the obvious one, and which is why I'm kind of saved it for last. And I don't want to put too much of this on you, but obviously, as you alluded to earlier, this is a novel about a delivery boy, and it's being published in this moment where people are having more stuff delivered than ever. It's a novel about precarity and an extremely precarious moment. I just wanted to know, but I know you wrote it beforehand, so I just wanted to know, and I think maybe the audience would like to know too, like, what does it feel like to put this book out now as opposed to if it had, been a year ago or a year from now? Has it changed how you think about it, or?
Yes, it totally does. And I'm glad you brought that up because, that is, the delivery industry, the way it looks now in urban centers was not the way it looked at the moment that this book was written. So it's a very strange feeling to see the visibility now of this delivery system that in a way used to be much smaller and less visible. What I mean by that is that, there were deliveries from local restaurants and that kind of thing, but there wasn't this sort of immense workforce of TaskRabbit style delivery men and women out there, basically allowing us to live isolated in a pandemic. So the short answer is that it's extremely strange. But I do hope in my own stupid and illegitimate way that that people will look at those people on those bicycles with maybe just a hint more compassion and curiosity, having read this book.
Yeah, I think they will, and I think that's a great place to stop. And yeah, a great endorsement for the book.
And I'll actually add a little bit to what Peter is saying, because I even from our experience in the bookstore, but I think this year, especially those delivery people often became the only people that people saw. I mean, they actually did take on more significance. Even at the bookstore when we were closed, the UPS guy who normally, they come and they go, but now we're like, oh, here's somebody. It was kind of this heightened moment. And I think
yeah, right, a real corporeal human.
I know. Oh, and so I think that the people like this fellow here have taken on more. So, to people who actually think humanly that way, they realize, oh yes, this is a person, and it's sort of a moment for them if they're otherwise staying in their four walls and isolated from everyone. This has been wonderful. If you were meeting, where do you two get together? I mean, is there a bar or a restaurant or a park or something if you two are just jawing away? Because you seem like
we'd have to walk. I was trying to draw Andrew out to the Greenwood Cemetery, where I took a walk a couple of weeks ago with another mutual friend of ours, because it's gorgeous, it's outside, it's incredibly gothic and weird. And
I should say too that when we first met, our lunch hours that we would take together started turning into lunch afternoons, and I always felt covered by Peter because he was a more senior employee, even though he was in a different department. I was like, I can be 2 hours late to my desk. I'll just say I was with Peter, and Peter had, was on good terms with everyone. And so
you didn't realize yet that publishing is the place of the entitled long lunch.
Right. Yeah, it is. Yes. Anyway, but the two of you doing this tonight, feels like we're party to something like that, where the two of you can and do and will again get to do that in person. And it's been delightful to have you both carrying on this way tonight. And I think we'll get ready to put things to sleep as it's still snowing here in Seattle a little bit. So that's where it's for us. This is very, new country. It doesn't snow here that much. Thank you both. And thank you all for joining us from all the places you have. Thank you for the good comments, the good words, and take care. And we will get to see each other again sometime on the other side of all of this. But meanwhile, more of this too. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrew. Good night. Thanks.
Thank you so much.